Imagine for a moment a city sprawling across a desert canyon, its buildings reaching 5 stories toward a brilliant blue sky. A hub of culture, religion, and power that thrived for 300 years. Now, imagine it empty. The plazas are silent, the hundreds of rooms vacant, the only sound the wind whispering through stone doorways. This isn't science fiction. This is Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. What could possibly compel an entire civilization to build something so magnificent, only to vanish, leaving behind a ghost city of stone? We are about to peel back the layers of this profound mystery, a story that holds a chillingly relevant warning for our own time. To truly understand the epic rise and fall of this lost world, you need to join us on this entire journey. We will uncover evidence of unimaginable wealth, complex astronomy, and a dark social secret that ultimately tore this society apart from the inside. This is more than just history. It's a human drama written in stone and bone. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because each chapter of this story reveals a new piece of a puzzle that has haunted explorers for centuries. You will not want to miss what we find next. Our journey begins in the vast, sun-scorched landscape of the American Southwest, a place that seems, at first glance, inhospitable to grand civilizational projects. Yet, around the year 850, a cultural Big Bang occurred here. The people we now call the Ancestral Puebloans began constructing something the world had never seen. Let's step into the heart of their world, Pueblo Bonito. What we're looking at is not a simple village. It's an architectural marvel, a single integrated structure containing over 600 rooms, all precisely aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. This was the largest apartment building in North America until the 19th century, a masterpiece of masonry and engineering built without beasts of burden, the wheel, or metal tools. This was not an isolated wonder. Pueblo Bonito was the center of a vast network, a capital city connected to over 150 other great houses spread across thousands of square miles. And how were they connected? By a system of roads that defies simple explanation. We see them today, faint lines stretching across the desert. These were not meandering footpaths. They were meticulously planned, impossibly straight arteries, some 60 feet wide, that cut across mesas and valleys with a purpose that still baffles us. They seemed to lead from nowhere to nowhere, but they all pointed toward the canyon, the sacred center of their universe. This was a society with a plan, a grand vision executed on a scale that speaks of immense power and organization. But as we look closer at the remains of this incredible civilization, a more complex and unsettling picture begins to emerge. Excavations within the great houses of Chaco reveal a story of two different peoples. The skeletal remains found in the opulent rooms of Pueblo Bonito tell us of individuals who were taller, healthier, and lived longer lives. Their diet was rich in meat, a luxury in this arid environment. Meanwhile, the burials in the smaller outlying villages show people who were shorter, suffered from malnutrition and disease, and worked themselves to the bone. Here, we find our first critical clue: a stark physical divide between a well-fed elite and a struggling populace. This was a society built on more than just stone and faith. It was built on power. And that power was expressed through a single dazzling commodity: turquoise. We find thousands of pieces of it in the canyon, sky blue stones mined hundreds of miles away in intricate trade networks. This was their gold, their diamonds. It adorned the elite in death and likely in life, a vibrant symbol of their sacred status and their control over the common people who toiled to build the great houses and feed the mouths within them. They had built a world in the heart of the desert, a testament to human will. But as we sift through the dust of their abandoned homes, we are beginning to see the fine, almost invisible fractures in its foundation, cracks that would one day shatter their entire civilization. The dawn of the 10th century broke over a canyon buzzing with an energy that was about to reshape the very earth. Let us transport ourselves to that moment. What we are witnessing is not the slow, organic growth of a village. It is the execution of a grand design, a societal blueprint being etched into sandstone on an unprecedented scale. The old subterranean pit houses that had sheltered families for generations were giving way to something new, something that reached for the sky. These were the beginnings of the great houses, multi-story complexes designed with a geometric precision that speaks of a central authority, a single guiding vision. This was a conscious decision to build not just a settlement, but a center of the cosmos. To achieve this, they needed resources far beyond what the canyon itself could offer. As we trace the path of their materials, the sheer scale of the operation becomes breathtaking. The walls of these structures are composed of millions of sandstone blocks, each one quarried and shaped by hand. But the true testament to their organization lies in the timbers. The immense ponderosa pine logs that form the ceilings and floors came from mountains over 50 miles away. We must pause here and truly consider this. With no wheeled carts, with no beasts of burden, thousands upon thousands of trees, some weighing over 600 pounds, were felled, debarked, and carried across a rugged landscape by human power alone. We can almost feel the strain in the muscles, the burning of the desert sun on the backs of the men and women who made this monumental vision a reality. This was a pyramid project in the American desert, and it demanded a river of human labor. What could possibly motivate such a colossal undertaking? The answer, we believe, lies written in the sky. The Chacoan elite were not merely rulers, they were master astronomers. Their architecture was a calendar. We see doorways and windows aligned perfectly to capture the light of the solstice sun or the rising of a specific star. The great houses were cosmic engines designed to track the heavens and, in doing so, predict and control the seasons. The elite offered the people something invaluable: order in a world of uncertainty. They were the intermediaries to the gods, the keepers of the sacred knowledge that promised rain, bountiful harvests, and protection from the chaos of nature. For the common farmer living in a small outlying settlement, this was a powerful, even intoxicating bargain. In exchange for this divine security, the people gave their surplus corn, their pottery, and most importantly, their labor. A system was born, one of deep codependence. The center Chaco consumed resources voraciously, and the periphery, the hundreds of smaller villages, produced them. We see the great houses becoming more and more elaborate, their rooms filled with exotic goods like macaw feathers from Mesoamerica and the ever-present turquoise. This was not just a city being built, it was a social machine being perfected. An engine of belief and tribute that concentrated wealth and power into the hands of a select few who lived at the very heart of the canyon. They had successfully built a new world order upon a foundation of faith and stone, a perfectly balanced system that seemed destined to last 1,000 years, so long as the rains continued to fall. The power of the Chaconi elite, as we have seen, was built on their ability to organize society and direct labor, but its true foundation, the bedrock of their authority, was something far more ephemeral. It was knowledge, not just of agriculture or masonry, but of the cosmos itself. Let us now ascend from the canyon floor to a place where this secret knowledge was made manifest, a place that held the key to their entire belief system. We are climbing Fajada Butte, a silent stone sentinel that rises 135 meters above the desert, guarding the southern entrance to Chaco. For centuries, its secrets were kept not in a hidden room, but in plain sight, etched onto a rock face for the sun to read. What we find here, high on the butte's face, behind 3 colossal slabs of fallen rock, is deceptively simple. 2 spiral petroglyphs carved into the cliff wall hundreds of years ago. It was not until the year 1977 that their true purpose was rediscovered, and what was revealed sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology. This was no simple rock art. This was a celestial computer of breathtaking precision. As we watch the sun make its daily journey across the sky, we witness a stunning piece of celestial theater. At midday on the summer solstice, a single sharp shaft of light, a dagger of pure sun, appears through a gap in the rocks and perfectly bisects the larger spiral. At the winter solstice, 2 daggers of light precisely bracket the same spiral. At the equinoxes, a smaller dagger strikes the center of the second, smaller spiral. Here is where the story takes a turn from incredible engineering to profound social control. This device, what we now call the sun dagger, was more than a calendar. It was an instrument of immense power. Access to this high, remote place was almost certainly restricted. We can imagine a priest or a high-ranking elite member making a pilgrimage up the butte at the appointed time. They alone would witness the divine confirmation the moment the heavens affirmed their cosmic order. They would then descend to the waiting populace below, not with a simple announcement of the changing seasons, but with a prophecy fulfilled. Their ability to predict these celestial events was not seen as science. It was perceived as a divine connection, irrefutable proof of their favor with the gods. It was this perceived mastery over the sun that justified their earthly mastery over the people. But the genius of the Chacoan astronomers went even deeper into the much more complex and subtle cycles of the moon. As researchers studied the sun dagger further, they realized it also tracked the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, a far more difficult and esoteric pattern to observe. The shadows cast by the rock slabs at moonrise during this cycle aligned perfectly with the rings of the spiral. This is a level of astronomical observation that speaks to generations of patient sky-watching, of knowledge passed down and refined. They had created a system that not only predicted the seasons for planting and harvesting, but also synchronized their entire ritual life with the grand, slow-turning clockwork of the universe. This was the ultimate source of their legitimacy. They were the masters of time, the keepers of the sacred rhythms of existence. Yet, as we stand here in awe of their celestial wisdom, we must remember a chilling fact. For all their ability to predict the movements of the sun and moon, they could not command the clouds. Their perfect cosmic clockwork was utterly powerless against the one force that truly mattered in this arid land, the coming of a great relentless drought. While their dominion was cemented by a mastery of the heavens, the Chacan elite grounded their earthly power in something tangible, a stone the color of the sky itself. Turquoise. It was more than adornment, it was the lifeblood of their economy, the fuel for their social engine. Let us trace the arteries of this vast enterprise, a network of commerce and tribute that pulsed with a rhythm dictated by the canyon's powerful heart. The roads we saw earlier, those impossibly straight lines etched across the desert, were not just for pilgrims, they were conduits of wealth. We are looking at the material evidence of an empire built not on conquest, but on a carefully managed, religiously enforced system of trade. Our journey begins hundreds of miles away from the great houses in the rugged hills of what is now New Mexico. Here, In ancient pit mines, we find the source. We can almost picture the scene. Men and women from outlying villages toiling in the earth, chipping away at the rock to extract the precious blue-green veins. This was not a simple transaction. The turquoise they mined was likely considered a sacred offering, a tribute owed to the divine intermediaries who lived in the stone palaces of Chaco. The raw stone, loaded into woven baskets, would begin its long journey, carried on the backs of traders along those great straight roads, every step a testament to the canyon's immense gravitational pull. We have found over 200,000 pieces of turquoise in the canyon, an amount of concentrated wealth that is staggering to comprehend. Once it arrived in the canyon, the stone entered another world entirely. Within the walls of Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses, we uncover the workshops. Here, amidst the dust and debris, a different kind of labor took place. We find tiny stone drills, polishing stones, and countless fragments of turquoise, the refuse of a thriving jewelry industry. This is where the raw material was transformed into objects of power and beauty. Thousands upon thousands of beads were painstakingly drilled, polished, and strung into necklaces. Intricate mosaics were created, inlaying shells and jet with slivers of brilliant blue. But what is truly revealing is who was doing the work and who was wearing the final product. It is highly unlikely the priests and rulers were spending their days covered in stone dust. Instead, we see a specialized artisan class working to create the symbols of an elite they could never join. The flow of goods was not limited to this single precious stone. We see Chaco as the hub of a wheel with spokes reaching across the continent. From the west came seashells from the Pacific Ocean over 600 miles away. From the south, transported through a chain of traders stretching through the deserts of Mexico, came the vibrant feathers of scarlet macaws and even the birds themselves, kept in pens to supply a constant demand for ritual color. In return, the canyon offered its own unique exports, exquisitely crafted pottery and the promise of divine favor. This was an economic system of incredible sophistication, connecting the Chacoan world to distant cultures and landscapes. They had built a capital of consumption in the middle of a sparse desert, a place that drew in the rarest and most beautiful things the known world had to offer. They had perfected a system that turned faith into labor and labor into luxury. The great houses were not just ceremonial centers, they were glittering storehouses of continental wealth, a reality that must have created a chasm between the have-nots and the have-everythings, a divide that was growing wider with every new shipment of turquoise. The turquoise gleams, the macaw feathers shimmer, but these are just the trappings of power, the glittering surface of a much deeper reality. To understand the true nature of Chaco, we must now step across a threshold, an invisible line that separated two profoundly different worlds existing side by side within the same canyon. Let us walk through the grand doorways of Pueblo Bonito, leaving the harsh sun behind for the cool, shadowed interiors of the elite. The rooms here are spacious, with high ceilings, supported by those massive ponderosa pine beams we saw transported with such effort. The very air feels different, rarefied. We find not just living quarters, but spaces dedicated to something else entirely. We discover caches of ceremonial objects, intricate pottery that was never meant for daily use, and burial chambers containing individuals laid to rest with a king's ransom in turquoise jewelry. As we examine the human remains found within these privileged walls, a stark portrait emerges. These were people who were, on average, several inches taller than their contemporaries living just outside the great houses. Their bones show few signs of the nutritional stress or backbreaking labor that defined life for so many others. They ate well, a diet rich with protein from deer and antelope, a luxury the desert rarely afforded. They lived longer, healthier lives. This was a lineage, a dynasty. The evidence suggests that a person was not chosen to live here based on merit or wisdom, but was born into it. We are looking at the physical architecture of a caste system, a social order as deliberately constructed as the stone walls that enforced it. The great houses were not just communal apartments for everyone. They were the exclusive preserves of a ruling class that saw itself as fundamentally separate from and superior to the people who fed them and built their world. Now, let us leave this privileged inner sanctum and step back out into the glare of the common plaza. The difference is immediate and jarring. Here, in the smaller, more crowded dwellings clustered around the great houses, the story changes. The rooms are smaller, the construction simpler. The artifacts we find are utilitarian, grinding stones worn smooth with endless use, plain pottery for cooking, and simple tools for farming. The bones of the people buried here tell their own story, one of relentless toil. We see evidence of severe arthritis, even in the young. Their teeth are worn down from grit in their cornmeal diet, and their bodies show the marks of arrested development due to periods of starvation. They were the engine of this society, the hands that quarried the stone, the feet that carried the timber, the backs that bore the weight of a civilization whose greatest rewards they would never know. This division was not maintained by walls alone, but by a powerful ideology. The elite, with their mastery of the cosmos and their control over sacred rituals, were seen as something more than human. They were the living conduits to the gods, and their opulent lifestyle was not a matter of earthly greed, but of divine right. For the common farmer, bringing a portion of their meager harvest as tribute to the great house was not just paying a tax, it was a sacred duty, an offering to ensure the sun would continue to rise and the rains would, hopefully, continue to fall. They had constructed a social pyramid as perfect and as rigid as their masonry. At its peak, a handful of people touched the heavens. At its base, the masses held it up. But a pyramid built on such a steep and unforgiving gradient is dangerously unstable. It only needs a single sustained tremor to send the whole magnificent structure tumbling into dust. Let us now imagine the sensory experience of this privileged existence, a world apart from the dust and hunger outside. The air within the great houses was not filled with the smell of parched earth, but with the scent of burning piñon wood and roasting venison. Power was not an abstract concept. It was the sizzle of fat dripping onto embers, a sound the common people rarely, if ever, heard. As we delve into the refuse piles of the elite, what we find is not just a difference in degree, but a difference in kind. They feasted on antelope, deer, and bighorn sheep, animals hunted far from the canyon and brought back as tribute. This was the protein that built their taller, stronger bodies. But their access to exotic luxuries went even further, reaching a level of sophistication that is frankly astounding. When we analyze the chemical signatures left inside the unique cylindrical pottery vessels found only in these elite rooms, we find something astonishing. Theobromine, the chemical fingerprint of cacao. Chocolate. They were drinking hot chocolate, a ritual beverage imported over 1,200 miles from the rainforests of Mesoamerica. A bitter, frothy drink reserved for royalty and gods in the cultures to the south. The sounds of the canyon's heart were different too. We can almost hear it now, a sound utterly alien to this sandstone landscape. The sharp, raucous call of the scarlet macaw. These were not migratory birds. We have found their skeletons, sometimes carefully buried, showing they were kept alive here, hundreds of them, in the high desert, an environment completely unnatural for them. Imagine the visual spectacle. A common farmer arriving from an outlying village to deliver their corn tribute, stepping into the central plaza of Pueblo Bonito and seeing dozens of these brilliant red, yellow, and blue birds chained to perches or held by their keepers. It would have been like stepping into another dimension. These were not pets. They were living jewels, symbols of the elite's cosmic reach, their power to command not just people and resources, but the most beautiful and exotic life forms from a world the common person could not even imagine. Keeping these fragile birds alive in the dry canyon air was an act of conspicuous consumption, a daily demonstration of wealth so immense it could defy nature itself. This entire performance of opulence was carefully orchestrated political and religious theater. The great kivas, the subterranean chambers where ceremonies took place, would be filled with the smoke of sacred herbs and the chanting of priests adorned in turquoise and macaw feathers. The feasts were not simple meals, they were state dinners, designed to awe and bind the leaders of outlying communities to the canyon's authority. We see a system where tribute was rewarded with participation in these intoxicating rituals. A village leader who brought enough corn might be invited to witness a ceremony, to drink the bitter chocolate, to receive a piece of finished turquoise jewelry. It was a brilliant strategy of co-option. It gave the provincial leaders a taste of the divine, making them invested partners in a system that exploited their own people. The lords of Chaco were not simply enjoying their wealth, they were weaponizing it, transforming luxury into an unbreakable chain of obligation and belief. Yet, this entire magnificent edifice of power and privilege rested on a foundation that was becoming increasingly brittle. The elaborate rituals, the feasting, the importation of tropical birds, all of it required a constant, ever-growing river of resources flowing into the canyon. The population within the great houses was expanding, and their appetites with it. The forests that provided their timber were being slowly depleted. The surrounding land, farmed relentlessly to produce the necessary surplus of corn, was growing tired. The people who supported this system were being pushed to their absolute limit. This dazzling display of celestial favor and earthly wealth depended on one simple, fragile promise, that the sky would always answer their call. Away from the scent of cacao and the flash of macaw feathers, an entirely different world existed. Let us now journey just a few miles from the canyon's core to one of the hundreds of small anonymous settlements that served as the system's lifeblood. The great straight roads do not lead here. These places are reached by simple footpaths worn into the earth. The architecture tells a story not of cosmic alignment, but of pure survival. We find clusters of small single-story rooms and older pit houses built with rougher masonry and a sense of urgent necessity. This was not a place of performance or ceremony. This was the engine room, hidden in plain sight, where the fuel for Chaco's brilliance was painstakingly produced. The very landscape around us speaks of relentless effort. We can trace the outlines of their fields, small plots of land bordered by stones to catch what little moisture the sky offered. Here, farming was an act of faith performed with a digging stick and a prayer. Every single kernel of corn was a victory against the parched soil and the brassy sun. Water was not a given, it was a daily obsession. We see small, ingenious check dams and channels designed to guide every precious drop of runoff from a summer storm toward their thirsty crops. A failed harvest was not an economic setback. It was a sentence of hunger, a threat that was always present. This was a life lived on an unforgiving margin, a world away from the overflowing storerooms of Pueblo Bonito. Let us step inside one of these dwellings. The air is thick with smoke from a small hearth, the light dim. The space is cramped, shared by an entire family. The pottery we find here is not the elegant, specialized ware of the elite. It is thick, utilitarian, its surface blackened by 1,000 cooking fires. The central feature of this life, the sound that defined it, was the constant scrape of stone on stone. We can almost feel the ache in the shoulders and back as women knelt for hours at the metate, the grinding stone, converting hard kernels of corn into the coarse meal that formed their every meal. Forensic analysis tells us their story with brutal clarity. Their bones show us the cost of this life, shoulders and knees worn down by arthritis, teeth ground to the pulp from the inevitable grit in their food. This was a body shaped by servitude to the grinding stone in the field, and still the tribute flowed into the canyon. We must try to understand the immense psychological weight of this system. Withholding a portion of the harvest was not simply defying a ruler. In their worldview, it was a gamble with the cosmos, an act of impiety that could anger the gods and stop the rain for everyone. They were trapped in a cycle where their own faith demanded their own impoverishment. They were told their sacrifice, their corn, their very labor fueled the essential ceremonies that kept the world in balance. They were contributing to a sacred project, a promise that must have felt powerful and true in times of plenty, but which began to ring hollow with each hungry child and each cloudless sky. This was the great unacknowledged truth of the Chacon world. Its glittering superstructure, its astronomical genius, its continental reach, all of it was balanced upon the weary shoulders of a people who were systematically forgotten. We see them not as individuals in the record, but as a collective resource, their existence measured in bushels of corn and hours of labor. They were the invisible foundation, and that foundation was beginning to crack under a weight that was no longer just physical, but psychological. The social contract, written in faith and sealed with tribute, was fraying at the edges. A profound and dangerous question must have started to form in the quiet desperation of these outlying farms. What happens when the masters of the cosmos can no longer make it rain? That question, once a whisper of doubt on the parched lips of a farmer, was about to become a roar that would echo through the canyon for centuries. The perfect cosmic clockwork of the elite could predict the sun to a fraction of an inch, but it was useless against a sky that had simply decided to stop giving. We begin in the late 11th century, as the first signs appeared, not as a dramatic storm, but as a creeping, terrifying absence. The summer monsoon clouds, which for generations had gathered like clockwork over the mountains, began to thin. The life-giving downpours became hesitant sprinkles, then nothing at all. The sky, once a canvas of divine drama, became a flat, unchanging sheet of brilliant, merciless blue. As we look at the tree ring data from this period, the silent witnesses of this ancient catastrophe, the story becomes chillingly clear. Beginning around the year 1130, we see the rings constrict, squeezing together into a tight band of starvation. This was not a single bad year. It was the beginning of a great drought, a 50-year-long agony that would strangle the entire region. For the people on the margins, the effect was immediate. The check dams they had so carefully built sat useless beside channels of dry, cracked earth. The corn stalks in their fields grew stunted, their leaves yellowing before they could produce their precious ears. The reserves of food, already meager, vanished. We can almost taste the bitter dust that replaced the cornmeal in their diet. Within the great houses, the initial response was not panic, but a powerful display of faith. Let us peer into the great kivas during this time. The ceremonies would have become more elaborate, more frequent, more desperate. We can imagine the priests chanting for days on end, their voices growing hoarse in the subterranean chambers. The demand for tribute would have intensified. They needed more offerings, more turquoise, more sacred macaw feathers to appease the angry sky gods. From the perspective of the elite, this was the only logical course of action. The system had always worked. The problem was not the formula. The people were simply not providing enough spiritual fuel. They projected an aura of absolute certainty, even as their own storerooms began to lighten, and the lines of tribute bearers from the outlying villages grew shorter. This is the moment the social contract truly shatters. For the farmer watching his family starve, the arrival of a tribute collector from the canyon was no longer a sacred obligation. It was an act of predation. The macaw feathers and chocolate rituals of the elite were no longer symbols of a connection to the divine, but obscene displays of a wealth they could no longer afford to support. The roads that had once been arteries of a grand shared enterprise now seemed like veins draining the life from the countryside. We see evidence of this breakdown in the archaeological record. Outlying villages begin to show signs of defensive walls, of being abandoned not peacefully, but in haste. The flow of goods into the canyon slows to a trickle. The engine of Chaco was seizing up. The great houses, once the vibrant heart of a thriving civilization, started to become gilded prisons. They held the symbols of power, the accumulated wealth of centuries, but they were cut off from the very people who gave that power meaning. The lords of the canyon, who had claimed to command the sun and moon, stood powerless before an empty sky. The silence from the heavens was finally being answered by a growing murmur from the earth, the sound of a people realizing their gods were not in the kivas. Their gods had been living beside them all along, and they were thirsty too. The murmur from the earth was growing into a defiant shout. Faced with a silent heaven and a restive population, the lords of the canyon did what all crumbling regimes do. They did not relent. They doubled down. Let us enter a great kiva in the year 1140, not as celebrants, but as unseen observers of a society turning inward on itself. The ceremonies we witness now are no longer just displays of cosmic knowledge. They have a new, harder edge. A frantic energy replaces the stately confidence of the past. The chanting is louder, the dances more frenetic, as if the sheer force of human will could physically compel the clouds to form. Power was no longer being demonstrated. It was being desperately asserted against the terrifying evidence of its own impotence. The archaeological record from this exact time shows us a disturbing shift. As we sift through the layers of debris that filled these sacred chambers in their final years, we find objects that speak of this rising desperation. We see ceremonial items, once treated with reverence, broken and discarded. We find an increase in the burning of precious goods, vast quantities of turquoise beads and intricately woven textiles turned to ash. This was not a celebration of wealth, but a bonfire of vanities, an immense, screamingly expensive sacrifice aimed at a sky that refused to listen. It was a strategy of shock and awe directed at the supernatural, a final, extravagant gamble with the last of their accumulated riches. But when even this failed, the sacrifices became something far darker. Let us now turn our attention to the evidence that for decades scholars were hesitant to even discuss. It is a story told not by petroglyphs, but by bones. We are examining human remains from this period, not from formal, respectful burials, but from the jumbled trash heaps and abandoned rooms of the great houses. What we find here is profoundly unsettling. These are not the skeletons of warriors fallen in battle. We see the bones of men, women, and children, and they have been systematically processed. We can trace the fine, sharp cut marks made by stone blades around the joints, marks identical to those left when butchering a deer. We see long bones smashed open, presumably to extract the marrow. Most chillingly, we find human bone fragments in cooking pots, their surfaces polished by the act of being boiled in a stew. We must be very clear here. This was likely not cannibalism for survival. The starving farmers on the periphery were not storming the great houses to eat the elite. The evidence suggests something far more organized, more ritualized, and infinitely more terrifying. This was a new kind of ceremony, born from the absolute conviction that the old ways were no longer enough. The universe demanded a greater price. The victims, likely brought from the rebellious outlying villages, were not just being killed. They were being unmade, their humanity systematically stripped away in a public performance of ultimate dominance. It was a horrifying message, sent in two directions at once. To the gods, it was the most extreme offering imaginable. To the living, it was a brutal demonstration of what happened to those who questioned the authority of the canyon's lords. This was the final, terrible evolution of their power. An ideology that began with predicting the solstice ended with the ritual consumption of human beings. They had traveled the full terrifying distance from masters of the cosmos to masters of terror. Yet, even this ultimate transgression, this breaking of the most profound human taboo, yielded nothing. The sun continued to bake the cracked earth. The sky remained a flawless, empty vault. The rains did not return. Their last, most desperate ritual had failed, and in its horrifying silence, the entire moral and spiritual justification for their existence evaporated into the dry desert air. The silence that followed the last failed ceremony was of a new and terrible kind. It was not the quiet of reverence, but the stillness of a vacuum, the moment after a spell has broken and the magician is revealed to be just a man. Let us now stand in the heart of Chaco around the year 1150. The air itself feels different, thin and brittle with a tension that has finally snapped. The fear that had held the social order together for generations had not vanished. It had curdled into something far more volatile. It had become rage. The people on the margins who had been drained of their food, their labor, and finally their own kin for rituals that brought no rain, had nothing left to lose. The cosmos had proven indifferent. Their masters had been exposed as frauds. We can pinpoint the moment of ignition not in a great battle, but in 1,000 small acts of defiance that coalesced into a firestorm. Imagine a tribute party, sent from a great house to a starving village, being met not with downcast eyes and meager offerings, but with the cold, hard stares of men and women holding their farming implements not as tools, but as weapons. The digging stick becomes a spear. The stone axe for shaping wood becomes an instrument for shattering bone. This was not a revolution with a leader or a manifesto. It was a visceral, spontaneous rejection of an entire world order. The great straight roads, once channels of tribute flowing inward, now served a new purpose. They became avenues of vengeance, carrying angry mobs from the periphery into the sacred center that had bled them dry. Let us now walk through the plazas of Pueblo Bonito during these final violent days. The scene is one of utter chaos. We see the sacred symbols of the elite being systematically destroyed. The elegant pottery, once used to serve chocolate to visiting dignitaries, is smashed against the stone walls. The looms that produced fine textiles are set ablaze. We look toward the pens where the scarlet macaws were kept, living emblems of power. The birds are gone, likely killed in a final brutal repudiation of the elite's claim to a world beyond the canyon. This was iconoclasm, the tearing down of idols. Every shattered pot, every burned feather was a shout of denial against the ideology that had justified generations of inequality. The violence did not stop at objects. It turned upon the great houses themselves and upon the people within them. We can follow the trail of destruction into the once pristine rooms of the ruling class. Doorways are smashed, and we find evidence of intense, localized fires set not to warm a hearth, but to gut a structure. And in these burned rooms, we find the bodies. The skeletons of the elite, when we find them from this period, tell a story that is a grim inversion of their ancestors. They are not in carefully prepared burial crypts adorned with turquoise. They are often found where they fell, sometimes in groups, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of violence. We see skulls crushed by blunt force trauma, bodies left in unnatural positions, discarded with the same finality as a broken pot. The ultimate desecration was reserved for the spiritual heart of their power, the kivas. Let us descend into one of these chambers, not filled with chants and incense, but with the stench of death and the silence of ashes. The sacred niches in the walls are empty. The sipapu, the symbolic portal to the underworld, has been deliberately filled with trash and debris. In some we find human remains unceremoniously thrown in, the final act of contempt for a religion that had demanded everything and given back only dust and horror. The lords of the canyon were not just killed, they were being spiritually erased. Their connection to the cosmos was being violently severed, their sacred spaces turned into tombs. The social pyramid had not just crumbled, it had been inverted, and its gilded capstone was now buried deep beneath the rubble of its own making. The smoke from the gutted kivas eventually thinned, revealing a landscape of profound and terrible silence. The rage that had torn through the canyon had spent itself, leaving behind not peace, but a void. Let us stand with the victors in the empty plazas of Pueblo Bonito. They had torn down their gods, but the sky remained stubbornly empty. The drought had not broken. The sun, which had once been their deity, was now just a relentless, indifferent star burning in a cloudless expanse. The brutal truth began to settle like dust on the rubble. They had destroyed the system, but they had not solved the problem. The very foundation of life, water, was still gone. And now, the social machinery that organized its storage and distribution, however unjust, was shattered beyond repair. What we witness next is not a triumphant rebuilding, but a slow, heartbreaking dissolution. There was no single order to leave, no grand proclamation. It was a decision made in countless small, smoke-filled rooms, a consensus reached in the language of hungry children and empty pots. The great houses, once the ladders to the heavens, had become monuments to a colossal failure. They were tainted, their sacred geometry now a map of deceit, their walls echoing with the violence of their end. We can imagine a family looking up at the 5 stories of stone, structures their own ancestors had built with their sweat, and seeing not a home, but a tombstone. There was nothing left here but the ghosts of a broken promise. So they began to walk. Let us follow one family as they turn their backs on the canyon for the last time. They carry very little. A basket with the last of the corn, a water gourd, a few simple tools. They do not walk on the great straight roads. Those were the paths of tribute and power, and they led only to this place of ruin. Instead, they follow the animal trails, the dry riverbeds, heading toward the distant mesas and mountains where, perhaps, the clouds still gathered. This was not one great migration. It was 1,000 separate journeys of severance, a civilization unspooling thread by thread. As we pan out, we see these small groups fanning out across the desert, a quiet diaspora born of desperation and disillusionment. The abandonment itself was a final, silent act of judgment. We find rooms with pottery left on the floor, grinding stones resting where they were last used. It suggests a departure that was not panicked, but deliberate. It was a conscious and complete rejection. They sealed doorways not to protect what was inside, but to entomb the past, to leave the entire colossal apparatus of their former lives behind. For over 300 years, all paths had led to Chaco. It was the center of their universe, the source of meaning, the heart that pumped the lifeblood of their culture. Now they were intentionally breaking those connections, choosing uncertainty in the wilderness over the certainty of starvation in their magnificent, empty city. What remains is the silence, a quiet so deep it feels like an indictment. The winds of the next 8 centuries would scour the plazas and whisper through the hundreds of vacant rooms. The sun would continue its perfect celestial alignments through windows that no one was there to see. They had built a masterpiece of stone and sky, a society of breathtaking complexity and ambition, and when it finally demanded a price too high to pay, they simply walked away, leaving a million stones to bear silent witness to a world that had devoured itself. They were not a people who vanished. They were a people who chose to survive, and survival meant leaving the very idea of Chaco to die alone in the sun. The stones of the canyon can only tell us so much. They speak of ambition, of cosmic alignment, of power. But to understand the human cost of its collapse, we must listen to a quieter, more intimate testimony. Let us now step away from the grand architecture and into the forensic lab, where the final brutal chapter of Chaco is written not in stone, but in bone. The human skeleton, you see, is a patient biographer. It records every illness, every period of hunger, and every act of violence in a language that, once learned, cannot be misread. And the stories these bones tell are a harrowing confirmation of the chaos we have just witnessed. What we are looking at now, laid out on a sterile cloth, are the remains of an individual from the final occupation of Pueblo Bonito. The first thing we notice is a specific kind of injury on the ulna, one of the bones in the forearm. It is a clean, healed fracture, what forensic anthropologists call a Perry fracture. This is the classic defensive wound of a person raising their arm to block a blow. This single bone tells a story of a life that had become defined by violence, a world where warding off an attack was a common enough occurrence to leave a permanent mark. This was not a society at peace with itself. The evidence we find across dozens of remains from this period shows a pattern of blunt force trauma, of lives ended with a brutal efficiency that speaks of neighbor turning against neighbor. But the story gets darker still. As we examine the fragments of bone recovered from the refuse pits and burned out rooms, we are forced to confront the truth of the desperate rituals mentioned before. These are not merely the remains of the dead, they are the leftovers of a meal. We can see, under magnification, the telltale signs that distinguish ritual cannibalism from simple starvation. There are fine, deliberate cut marks at the joints, where muscles were expertly removed from the bone. The long bones have been systematically smashed open with hammerstones to get at the nutritious marrow inside. And most damning of all, the ends of some bone fragments have a peculiar sheen, a distinctive brightness known as pot polish. This is the signature of being boiled in a ceramic pot for hours, rubbing against the gritty interior until the bone itself is worn smooth. This evidence forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Who was being eaten? And by whom? The victims were not confined to a single gender or age. We find the remains of men, women, and even children processed in this manner. The locations of these remains, found within the great houses themselves, strongly suggest this was not an act of the starving masses. This was something performed by the residents of these elite structures. It was the system devouring itself. We are looking at the final desperate act of a ruling class that, having lost its connection to the gods, tried to absorb power directly from the human body itself. It was a complete inversion of their original promise to bring life from the sky, now replaced by the grim reality of taking it from their own people. The ultimate proof of the social order's total collapse is found in how the dead were treated. Gone are the elaborate crypt burials of their ancestors, laid to rest with hundreds of turquoise necklaces. The elite of Chaco's final generation were not buried at all. They were discarded. We find their bodies, often bearing the marks of extreme violence, thrown into abandoned rooms or tossed into kivas that had been deliberately filled with trash. Their final resting places were not tombs, but garbage dumps. This was the ultimate act of desecration, a final statement by the survivors that these were not fallen leaders to be mourned. They were failed gods, their authority and their very humanity stripped away, their bodies left to be forgotten among the rubble of their broken world. The dust of Chaco's collapse did not settle into a final, silent grave. It became seeds carried on the wind. For the people who turned their backs on the canyon, survival was not a return to a simpler past, but a radical, conscious reinvention of the future. Let us follow their scattered footprints away from the canyon's gaping wound, tracking a diaspora that would reshape the entire Southwest. We see them moving not as a single defeated nation, but in smaller family groups and clans, seeking new springs, new patches of fertile land, a new beginning far from the ideological poison of their former home. They journeyed south toward the lands of the Zuni, east to the great river that would one day be named the Rio Grande, and north into the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. They carried with them a scar tissue of memory, a first-hand knowledge of a world that had spectacularly failed. Here we can see the birth of a new idea, an idea forged in the crucible of social collapse. As these refugee populations began to establish new settlements, we notice a profound change in their architecture, the most durable expression of their worldview. Gone are the monolithic great houses, the centralizing symbols of power that reached 5 stories high. In their place, we see smaller, more modest pueblos built on a human scale. The communities are still organized, but the principle is different. Power is now deliberately decentralized. We see the rise of multiple kivas within a single village, each one belonging to a different clan or society. The sacred knowledge, once the hoarded treasure of a priestly elite, was being distributed, entrusted to the community as a whole. This was not a regression. This was a revolution. What we are witnessing is not an ending, but a deliberate and painful course correction. The Chacan experiment, with its rigid hierarchy, its god-kings and its tribute economy, was now seen for what it was: a dangerous deviation. We can read this rejection in the very layout of the new towns. Plazas are central and accessible, designed for the entire community, not as stages for elite performance. There's a newfound emphasis on communal storage, on sharing resources, on a social structure that valued cooperation over coercion. It is as if these survivors were inoculating their new societies with architectural antibodies, designing their world to specifically resist the kind of centralized power that had led their ancestors to ruin. The memory of the turquoise lords and their dark rituals became a foundational cautionary tale. This is a story that has never truly ended, because the descendants of those who walked away are still here. The modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, the Hopi, the Zuni, and the many communities along the Rio Grande are the living legacy of this ancient upheaval. Their histories, passed down through generations, often speak of a time when the people grew too powerful, when leaders forgot their sacred duty to the whole, and the world was thrown out of balance. They speak of a great migration, a time of wandering and rebuilding. When we listen to these oral traditions, we are hearing the human echo of the trauma we have uncovered in the bones and broken pottery of Chaco. The archaeological evidence tells us what happened. Their stories tell us what it meant. They had learned, through fire and starvation, that a society built like a pyramid is destined to be crushed under its own weight. The new world they built was circular, a collection of interdependent clans and communities bound by shared ritual and mutual obligation. The great houses of Chaco stand as a monument not to a lost people, but to a lost idea. The people themselves, wiser for the fall, endured. They carried the memory of the canyon not as a treasure, but as a warning, a foundational story about the profound danger of letting the few forget they are part of the many. And so the canyon fell silent. Yet the ghosts that haunt this place are not just those of its last violent inhabitants. They are the ghosts of unanswered questions. As we walk these empty plazas today, we are no longer just chroniclers of a collapse. We become detectives, sifting through a crime scene 8 centuries old, where the central mystery is not who died, but how they truly lived. Every stone, every potsherd, every impossibly straight line carved into the desert floor is a piece of evidence. But the testimony is often contradictory, speaking to a reality far stranger and more complex than we can easily imagine. The story of Chaco's end is written in blood and bone, but the story of its existence remains a grand, unsolved enigma. Let us consider again those bewildering roads. We have traced them as arteries of tribute, but this explanation feels incomplete, unsatisfying. They are too wide, too straight, too impractical for people carrying baskets of corn. They ascend sheer cliff faces with carved stairways, where a simple path winding around would have been far easier. As we map this vast network, a different picture emerges, one less about economics and more about cosmology. The roads connect the great houses not just to outlying communities, but to significant landforms, to distant mountain peaks, to places that held a deep spiritual power. Could it be that these were not highways for the living, but for the gods? Or for the spirits of the dead, traveling in ceremonial procession? This idea changes everything. It suggests the entire landscape was a single integrated temple, and the roads were its sacred lines of power. This sense of profound mystery only deepens when we try to answer the most basic question of all. How many people actually lived in these magnificent structures? We see over 800 rooms in Pueblo Bonito alone, and we naturally envision a bustling city. But as we look closer, the evidence tells a different story. We find surprisingly few hearths. The fireplace is essential for cooking and warmth. Many of the rooms are small, dark, and lack any features of a living space. They feel less like apartments and more like bank vaults. The emerging theory is as radical as it is compelling. The great houses were never home to a large permanent population. They were instead vast, mostly empty ceremonial theaters, storehouses for tribute, and temporary residences for a small, rotating elite of priests and administrators. The city we imagined was perhaps never a city at all, but something else, a North American Vatican in the desert, occupied by a skeleton crew of holy caretakers for most of the year. This reframes our entire understanding of Chaco. It was not a place of production, but of pure consumption, a black hole of faith and labor that drew everything inward. The immense walls were not built to house a thriving populace, but to project an image of power, to store the wealth that was the physical proof of the elite's divine connection. As we stand here, in the shadow of a 5-story wall that may have sheltered only a handful of people, we are confronted with the true, staggering scale of their ambition. They did not just build a city, they built an idea, an engine of belief made manifest in stone. And it is because that idea was so unique, so alien to our modern conceptions of what a society should be, that even after a century of study, we are still decoding the ruins, listening for answers in the wind that now sweeps through the empty rooms where a lost world was dreamed into being. Let us stand here one last time, in the heart of this immense silence. The wind that moves through these empty doorways does not just carry dust. It carries a question, one that has been waiting patiently for 800 years. What we have explored together is not merely the autopsy of a dead civilization. It is a mirror. The story of Chaco Canyon is a controlled experiment in collapse, a history of a society that achieved breathtaking complexity in isolation, only to find itself trapped by the very systems that made it great. And its ghost is here to tell us that we are not so different. The forces that brought these walls down are the same forces that now test the foundations of our own world. We see a society that pushed its environment past the breaking point. For centuries, the Chacans harvested the forests and channeled the water, building a world that demanded more than the desert could sustainably give. They were brilliant engineers, but they were gambling against a climate they did not control. When that climate changed, when the 50-year drought arrived, their entire infrastructure of survival became a monument to a miscalculation. As we watch our own polar ice melt and our forests burn, this part of their story echoes with an uncomfortable familiarity. They learned too late that no amount of faith or architectural genius can negotiate with an empty sky. More critically, we see the fatal flaw of extreme inequality. The lords of Chaco insulated themselves from the hardship that their system created. While they feasted on imported luxuries and performed rituals in magnificent kivas, the people who fueled their world were slowly starving. This chasm between the elite and the commons was not a byproduct of their success. It was a central feature of it. When the crisis came, there was no shared sense of purpose, no reservoir of goodwill to draw upon. There was only a deep and bitter resentment. The system was too rigid to bend because those at the top had no incentive to change a world that served them so perfectly, even as it crumbled beneath their feet. Their final fatal error was a failure of imagination. Faced with undeniable evidence that their methods were failing, the elite did not innovate, they intensified. They poured the last of their society's wealth into more elaborate rituals, into grander sacrifices, clinging to the belief that the only thing required for a different result was a more fervent application of the same failed formula. They were trapped by their own ideology. Their power was so completely tied to their claim of cosmic control that to admit failure was to admit their entire existence was a fraud. This ideological brittleness is perhaps the most chilling parallel of all. It shows how a society's foundational story, the very source of its strength, can become the reason for its inability to adapt and survive. The great houses did not fall because of a drought. They were pushed. They fell because the social contract that held up every stone had been rendered meaningless. Chaco's lesson, written in bone and scattered turquoise, is that the true measure of a society's strength is not the height of its walls, but the resilience of its connections. It is about how it cares for its most vulnerable and how it adapts in the face of crisis. They show us that a pyramid, for all its structural power, is a fragile thing. When the base gives way, the summit is the first to come crashing down. The canyon asks a question that resonates across 800 years. Does a society have to collapse before it is willing to change? Let us know in the comments what you believe the great houses of our own time are, and what happens when the tribute that supports them stops flowing. If this journey into a collapsed world has given you a new perspective on our own, join us for more explorations into the past that define our present by subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep asking these vital questions.